Hello there, and welcome to the Upgrade webinar. The webinar that's going to help you understand the short answer questions from your learner assessment booklet as you go through the TAE Upgrade program from the TAE 40110 to the 40116. Okay, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the Success Training Academy's webinar series, and you will find that this particular webinar is going to be one of two webinars that you're going to go through, and the first webinar is going to be about the knowledge aspects so that you can go through the short answer questions with as much confidence as possible to answer the questions. And then the second webinar that we'll look at is how do you go through the actual projects and how do you develop your assessment tools. Okay, so strap in, we're going to have a good time, and my intention is to give you enough, perspective on the questions so that you know exactly where to look on Google and you know where to look in the textbook so that you can find the answers easily and effortlessly. All right, so let's get into it. As a side note, the textbook chapters that you'll be looking at are chapters 9, 10, and 11. Okay, chapters 9, 10, and 11 will relate to the assessment cluster, and you'll be able to find those chapters on the student portal, and also if you come to class, you can ask your trainer about where you can find the textbook as well. All right, so let's get into it. All right, let's calm down. All right, all this information is just for your knowledge, and you can read through it at your own time. It's basically just about how you'll be assessed, the requirements for your answers, submission, and all those different admin aspects. Okay, so coming down. All right, so in this section, make sure you put your name, sign it, and put the date. Okay, you can leave this section blank. Put your name, put the date that you started the program, and leave the rest blank. Okay, put your name, put the unit start date, and put the unit, well, just leave this blank for now, and the rest blank. Okay, pop your name, unit start date, and leave the rest blank. Okay. So as I said, we're going to go through some short answer questions, and then later on I'll walk you through the projects. Okay, so just one other thing to mention: if for any reason at all you see that the numbering of the booklet or the design of the booklet or the wording of anything at all is slightly different, just be aware that we do update our booklets. Okay, and so the majority of the questions are all going to be exactly the same, but aesthetically you may see the book slightly differently. Okay, but just be okay with that. So if you get a book in a workshop or in the mail and it's slightly different to the webinar, just don't panic. You're going to find that the questions that we cover are pretty much identical, but we may have just changed the version number or done something differently to the booklet. Okay, so just be okay with that. Okay, so let's check out these short answer questions. So question 1, suggest 3 attributes of ethical behavior you would expect of an assessor. Okay, so when we go through these questions, make sure you put in good sufficient detail, not just one-word answers. As we can see here, we want to put in a couple of sentences. All right, so question 1 there, suggest 3 attributes of ethical behavior you would expect of an assessor. So a good way to approach this is, what are 3 things that you would never want an assessor to do? So you'd never want them to lie, sign documents that they didn't believe in. You wouldn't want them to show bias. You wouldn't want them to give poor feedback. You wouldn't want them to be late. All those kind of things. So the opposite would be that they were that they were punctual, that they were well organized, that they were professional, that they were honest, they were fair in their judgment, and they gave empowering feedback. Okay, so those are some ideas that you can put in there, and naturally you can come up with your own ideas as well. Okay, but make sure that you explain those ideas in a bit of detail. Okay, question 2, explain what is meant by the following terms. All right, so we got work focused, criterion referenced, standards based, evidence based. Okay. Now, what I suggest that you do is go to Google and literally type in work-focused assessment and see what comes up. Okay. You can also check out the textbook and see what it mentions around those definitions. Okay. These do overlap quite a bit, and you will find that there are some commonalities in how people perceive these definitions, okay? But head to a textbook, head to Google, and just see what comes up, okay? So, coming down, question 3. What is the main purpose of conducting RPL or RCC assessment, okay? RPL, as we all know, stands for Recognition of Prior Learning. RCC stands for Recognition of Current Competency. So we could say that training and assessment trains people on new skills and assesses them on new skills. RPL discusses current or existing skills that somebody may have. Okay. RCC talks about current qualifications that they may already have. Okay. So RPL, the purpose is to recognize current skills and knowledge in order to issue them with a qualification. RCC, the purpose of that is to issue credit transfers for units that students may already have from a previous qualification that they may have done. Okay. Again, I suggest that you head to Google and type in RPL purpose and see what comes up. Okay, you would want to also Google RCC and see what comes up. Okay, question 4. What role does a unit of competency play in assessment in nationally accredited training? Okay, so what I suggest that you do, go to Google and type in unit of competency. All right, see what comes up. But as a side note, the unit of competency basically is the benchmark that people are trained against for industry relevant skills. Okay, so ultimately, when we are training people in the workplace, we are training them against units of competency, and we are training them against the performance criteria that are in the units of competency. Okay, so it really forms the crux of everything that we do for industry-based training. Okay. Cool. B, what parts of a unit of competency should you refer to in order to cover the requirements and conditions for assessment? Well, in a unit of competency, the specific areas that relate to assessment are the following: performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and assessment conditions. Okay, and the assessment conditions specifically are going to tell us exactly what qualifications the assessor needs to have. They're going to tell us what specifically the environment needs to be in which the candidates are trained. It's going to tell us the types of equipment, and it's going to tell us the types of acceptable assessment methods that are used as well. Okay. So coming down, C, list each part and state why it must be met in terms of the rules of evidence. Okay. So we have, for example, performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and assessment conditions. Okay, so what you want to put in here is, for example, performance evidence. We must see performance that is valid, authentic, current, and sufficient, and you can describe that in a bit of detail. We can say knowledge evidence. We must see knowledge that is correct. It is proven to be the candidate's own work. The knowledge is up to date, and there is enough evidence to be able to make a decision. And the assessment conditions, you can say absolutely that the assessment conditions must also be met in a valid, authentic, current, and sufficient way. Okay. Question 5, you are required to contextualize the following performance criteria for assessment in a workplace. Okay, so the workplace itself is Happy Days theme park. Okay, now this task that we're about to ask you to do is a task that you will regularly be asked to do when you are designing assessment tools. Okay. And the assessment tools are always based on performance criteria, as we know, and performance evidence, knowledge evidence, right? Now here, the performance criteria that we're working with is use appropriate interpersonal skills to accurately identify and clarify customer needs and expectations. Okay, so we're imagining that we need to assess that, and we need to assess somebody in a theme park doing that. So we might imagine that somebody works at the information booth, and we might do an observation checklist on this person. Okay, so it could be a statement such as, while interacting with customers, the candidate smiles and asks appropriate questions, full stop. Or another one could be, let's say they work at a retail store at the theme park. So it could be, while serving customers at the cash register, they ask good open-ended questions to identify what the customer needs in the shop. Okay, or it could be, let's see what else we got. Interpersonal skills to accurately identify and clarify customer needs and expectations. What else could we have? While working at the shop, the candidate courteously and in a friendly manner helps the customer find what they are looking for in the store. Okay. So what we're trying to do is create a statement that would effectively assess this item here. Okay. So question 6, list the 4 principles of assessment and briefly explain how each may be addressed when planning an assessment. Okay, so as many of you would know, the principles of assessment are valid or validity, flexibility, reliability, and fairness. Okay, so what I suggest is you go to Google and type in principles of assessment. Okay, those 4 will come up, and then ask yourself, how would I make sure that an assessment is valid? Okay, and probably what comes to mind is mapping. Okay, making sure that things align to the unit. Okay, flexibility. Well, probably when you Google flexibility, you're going to come across things like contextualization. All right. Then if you Google reliability, you're going to come across things like making sure the assessment is used in the same way by all assessors. Okay. Fairness, well, that naturally relates to reasonable adjustment. Okay. So that is question 6 there for you. Question 7. In column A, list 3 different assessment methods and provide an example where each method may be used and why it's most important. Okay, so we've got assessment method. So we've got observation, got written test, we've got portfolio. Okay, or we've got another one could be third party, or another one could be fault finding activities. Okay, so what we're going to ask you to do is, what would be the purpose of assessing someone that way? So let's say we picked observation. Well, the purpose of using observation would be to ascertain somebody's level of practical skills. Okay, written test would be to ascertain somebody's level of written knowledge. Oh, sorry, not written knowledge, that's silly. Knowledge about the topic. Okay, and let's say portfolio. Well, the purpose of a portfolio would be to ascertain the quality of somebody's evidence that they've been able to provide or create from a workplace or from independent study. Okay, so question 8, how do the 4 rules of evidence guide the way evidence is collected? Okay, so we've got valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Now, the way I like to think about the rules of evidence is the following, that essentially these are the criteria that a student's answer must meet. So we've got valid, authentic, current, sufficient. So a student's answer must be valid, i.e. it must be correct. Okay, and when we are looking at evidence from a RPL candidate, for example, we want to make sure that it's valid evidence and that it actually correlates to the unit of competency and what's actually required. Okay, A, authentic. This is essentially saying that the evidence that we gather must be the candidate's own work, and we must be able to ascertain that. Okay, so we must have some proof that it is the candidate's own work, and we can prove that they have provided it themselves. Okay. Current. The evidence provided must be up to date. And ideally, it's going to be something from the last 2 to 5 years. Okay. Sufficient, there must be enough of it to be able to make a decision. Okay. There must be enough evidence to be able to make a decision. Okay. And when we say enough, what we mean by that is there's enough to meet the unit criteria. In the unit, it says there must be 2 examples of. Well, we must actually make sure there's 2 examples of. Another thing to think about is also, is the answer that the student provides long enough? Okay. Question 9. In 2 to 3 sentences, explain the difference between an assessment tool and an assessment instrument. Okay. In here, we need to remember that the assessment tool is the overarching document. It is the entire set of assessments, okay? So we may have the assessment policies, procedures, the resubmission, rules and guidelines, the instructions for the assessor, instructions for candidates, okay? And we may have the observation checklist, the guide to the assessor for the observation checklist. We may have the written test, the instructions for the candidate. We may have absolutely everything together, and that's what's called the assessment tool, okay? But when we actually have the minor item, such as the role play card, or if we have the let's say observation checklist, okay, all those items individually are the assessment instruments, okay. However, all put together, that becomes the assessment tool. Now, these are very easy to make a mistake with, and it's also very easy to use the words interchangeably, but we need to remember that one of them is not the other and the other is not the other, okay? So make sure that you have good clarity around what is the tool and what is the instrument, okay? All of the instruments together make up the assessment tool. All right. Question 10. List and define the 3 types of evidence, okay? So we've got direct, indirect, and supplementary. We've got direct, indirect, and supplementary. Definition and example. So we need to think about what is some direct evidence. Well, typically it's when you observe someone do something, or when you have a written test, or something like that. Direct is essentially when you can physically look at and see someone doing something. Indirect is when you have evidence of them having done it and you can see that. So for example, a PowerPoint presentation printed out with their name on it would be indirect evidence, okay? Direct evidence would you be watching them do the presentation. The last part there, so we got direct, indirect, and supplementary. Supplementary is when somebody else says that their candidate has done it and can do it. Okay, so a third-party letter would be supplementary. Question 11. What assessment method would enable an assessor to judge a candidate's technical or subject knowledge? Okay. So in here, we are probably thinking about, well, technical knowledge. Probably technical knowledge would not be assessed via a portfolio or observation. It would probably be assessed by a written test or some theoretical approach, okay? So just have a think about an example where you would use a written test, and why would you use a written test, and I guess the best scenarios or the most appropriate times that you would use a written test, okay? Question 12. Complete the table below to show reporting requirements for hazard incidents in your workplace. Now, your answer is going to vary depending on where you work and what you do, okay? But we're just asking you to think about, if there was an incident in your workplace, how would you report that? If there was a near miss in your workplace, how would you report that? If there was a hazard, how would you report it? Okay, I can't give you the answer because I don't know your workplace. Okay, However, I know in many RTOs, there would be a hazard report form and you'd fill it out and you'd submit it to the appropriate person, okay? However, if there was an incident with a student and things like that, you need to think through that process, okay, and describe it in here, okay? Question 13, how do you identify a hazard within your work environment or in a training room setting? Now, this could be simply that you do an inspection of the training room 2 days beforehand or a day beforehand, and you look for any hazards using the hierarchy of control and using the control index and identifying the potentiality of hazards and the dangers and the risks. Okay. However, this is again going to be company dependent, and every company works off a different, risk rating scale. Okay. Question 14. Explain how you would address each of the following OH&S issues to ensure that the safety of a training environment, for which you are responsible. Assessment and risk control measures. Okay. Reporting requirements for hazards. Safe use and maintenance of relevant equipment. Okay, so again, this one is asking you, how do you ensure that risks are minimized? How do you report the hazards? How do you make sure that equipment is safe? So things like doing daily, not daily, but testing and tagging and daily equipment checks, things like that. Okay, emergency procedures. Well, in that case, doing regular evacuation drills, things like that, first aid drills. So sources of WHS information. Where would you find the OHS information or WHS information in your workplace? Okay, role of key work place persons. Who are the key people that work in the area of safety in your organization? Do you have a fire warden? Do you have an OH&S representative? Okay, so just describe that in a bit of detail. Okay, question 15, what is PPE and when might it be used? Okay, and as many of you would be aware, PPE stands for personal protective equipment. Okay, and I'd like you to think about your industry, think about the particular PPE that would be required for your workplace, and think about what are the most dangerous things that people will face on a day-to-day basis, and why would PPE be required? Okay, even something like a coffee shop, well, people still need to wear gloves, have an apron, a hairnet, things like that. Okay. Question 16. List the requirements your workplace or one with which you are familiar with to ensure all students know the requirements to using equipment. Okay. So, for example, when a staff member starts at your organization, do they actually get an induction, and do they get training on the equipment? What does that training look like? Okay, and how is it conducted? Okay, so describe that in there. Question 17, explain the role played by each of the following key personnel in a workplace in regards to safety. Okay, so what are workers' roles or workers' responsibilities in the area of safety? Okay, safety officers, what do they do in your organization, and what are their kind of roles and responsibilities? Okay, question 18, list 2 WHS responsibilities that a learner has. Okay, so obviously duty of care comes into this. And so, for example, a student should obviously not put another student in harm's way. A student should also make sure that they take care of their own safety. They should report any hazards to the trainer. They should follow safety procedures, all those different kind of things. Okay. Question 19. Training packages and competency standards are used as a benchmark for assessing a candidate for a national vet qualification. I mean, you can tick true or false, but I imagine if you're doing this course, you should be able to answer that question okay. All right. I'm sure you should be able to answer the question okay. I'm sure you should be able to answer the question okay. All right. Okay. All right, hopefully you got the hint there. All right, question 20. In 2 to 3 sentences, explain the term reasonable adjustment in VET and state an example of when it would be used. Okay, so as we all know, reasonable adjustment essentially is when we make adjustments to the training or the assessment approach. We make adjustments to the training or assessment approach, and we make it fair for somebody that may have a disability or an inherent mental, physical, or location challenge, right? So if somebody can't see or is blind, we may put the assessment into Braille, okay? Or if somebody can't read or write, we may put the assessment into, let's say, into a verbal form or a practical form, okay? Another reasonable adjustment could be maybe they've got learning challenges, so maybe we give them extra time for the assessment, okay? Maybe they've got reading challenges, so we put the directions into pictures, whatever it might be, okay? Question 21. Research two cultures different from your own. These may be ethnic cultures or even cultural differences between generations and genders. Provide an example. Briefly provide a narrative on how you would ensure equity and fairness when assessing individuals from those two cultures. Okay, so you can pick any two cultures. So you could pick Aboriginals, you could put Asians, you could pick Indian students, you could pick middle-aged students, you could pick older, I hate to say older, but you could pick older generations with low technological skills. You could pick, people from Islamic countries that have maybe religious traditions that need to be respected. Okay, so pick two of the cultures. So, for example, Aboriginal students. Go to Google and type in teaching Aboriginal students. See what comes up as a bit of a cultural reference and things that you need to be careful of as a trainer and assessor. Culture 2. Could be another culture that you're familiar with, and just Google it, see what comes up, okay? And just describe, if you were teaching those cultures, if you were assessing them, how would you make sure that you assess them in a fair manner, okay? Question 22. Explain in your own terms the meaning of each of the following. Copyright and privacy laws, okay? So when you describe this, try to describe it in relation to assessment. So how does copyright and privacy laws impact assessment, okay? Naturally one thing would be not making sure that you don't photocopy copious amounts of learning material from a textbook, or it could be another one, could be just stealing another company's assessment, and that would be obviously an infringement on copyright. Security of information. This can relate to people having access to your RTO's records and making sure that only the right people have access to personal data, okay? Plagiarism. Naturally, this relates to how does your RTO deal with plagiarism and what's its policy around it. So just describe that in a little bit of detail. Privacy and security of information. Again, this is encryption, this is passwords, this is who has access to what within your organization. Question 23. Explain the assessor's duty of care to the candidate in relation to occupational health and safety outcomes and concerns. Okay, explain the assessor's duty of care. Okay, so I guess the best way to think about this is that an assessor should never put a candidate in harm's way and should make sure that a candidate goes home safely, if that's the best way to think about it. So what should an assessor do to make sure that a candidate is never physically or mentally harmed by the process of assessment. So just explain that in a bit of detail and throw in an example from your world and your industry. Okay. Question 24. List 3 OH&S issues or WHS issues that could impact on the assessment process. So these could be things like the safe use of the equipment. It could be making sure that nobody else around the assessment area is in harm's way. It could be that the assessment is done in safe conditions outside or even inside. It could relate to the appropriate use of PPE. It could mean that the assessment is cancelled in the case that the conditions are too dangerous. Okay. Question 25. How should assessments be stored within your organisation and who has permission to alter them when changes are required? So just think about your organisation if you work in an RTO and think about if an assessment needs to be accessed, who has access to that? Okay, is it everybody in the organisation? And if a change needs to be made, who can make it? What's the approval process for the changes that are needing to be made? Okay, and just describe that, I guess, approval process that needs to be in place. Okay. Technically, you'd ideally want only the academic manager to be able to make those changes. Okay. Question 26. What are the 4 dimensions of competency? Okay. So if you go to Google and type in dimensions of competency, they're going to come up for you. But just to give you a hint, one of them could be task skills, another task management skills, another could be environment skills, I think, and another one could be contingency management skills. Okay. But definitely go to Google and type in dimensions of competency and see what comes up. You're going to find a plethora of information about the dimensions of competency. Cool. Question 27. When you're designing an assessment tool, how would you make sure that the dimensions of competency are integrated and incorporated into the process? Provide one example. Okay. So basically up here we've got the 4 dimensions of competency. So have a read through that on Google and think about how can I make sure that they are integrated as part of the assessment. I'm just going to give you one example. So one of the dimensions of competency is contingency management skills. It's about somebody's ability to manage things when things go wrong. Okay. So ultimately, as part of the assessment, we would need to make sure that there is one example of a problem-solving activity. We would need to make sure that a candidate knew what to do and could handle a situation if, for example, the equipment broke down or there was an emergency they need to take place that they need to deal with. Okay. So that would be an example of how you would incorporate it into the process. But there's 3 others, so pick one of the others and provide an example. Okay. Question 28. Who would be suitable people to trial an assessment on before conducting it on a real candidate? Naturally, when we create assessment tools, we don't want to use them straight away without trialing them first, okay? And we would probably want to choose maybe colleagues, fellow trainers, fellow assessors, maybe our academic manager, maybe past students. Anybody that's a subject matter expert would be great people to trial the assessment on. Okay, so anyone that's not a live candidate is going to be a great person to trial the assessment on. Okay, question 29. What are 2 methods that you could use to review the effectiveness of your assessment tools? Okay, and we can definitely check out the number of students. We could look at the statistics of the number of students that are getting achieving competency completion. We could also do validations. We could also do group moderation of results. Okay, so there's quite a few ways that we can review the effectiveness of the assessment tools. We can also get an external consultant to review the effectiveness. Okay, lots of different things. Okay, question 30. What are 3 different methods of validation that can be done? So you could have an external consultant coming in. You could have peer validation. You could even have independent validation. So when you individually sit down and review the assessment tools that you've got against the units of competency, or you can have peer or group validations, and you could have an external consultant come in as well. Okay, so question 44. What are the 3 ethical components that must be included as part of an assessment? Okay, cool. It jumps from question 30 to 44. Awesome. Now, a bit of a typo, everyone. Don't freak out. Don't freak out. So we got question 44 and 32. Don't freak out, everyone. It's just a typo. Okay. What are the 3 critical components that must be included as part of an assessment tool? Okay, hint, what would you include on a cover sheet? Okay, so probably instructions to candidates, instructions to assessors, a student declaration, expectations for competency, all those different kinds of things. Okay. What else? Yeah, instructions to candidates, instructions to assessors, and ways to submit, appeals policy, all those kind of things. All right, cool. So just go ahead and put those 3 things in there. All right, so now let's head back to question 32. All right, so why is it important that assessment tools meet the principles of assessment? Provide 1 example. Okay, so as we've talked about, principles of assessment are valid, flexible, reliable, and fair. Okay, valid, flexible, reliable, and fair. Okay, so what I suggest that you do in order to answer this question would be to provide the counter perspective. So what would happen if the assessment wasn't valid? Okay, what would happen if it wasn't flexible? What would happen if it wasn't reliable? What would happen if it wasn't fair? Okay, so just to pick one of them, for example, if it wasn't reliable. Now, reliability relates to the fact that all assessors use it in the same way, okay? So if all assessors don't use it in the same way, then obviously students are going to be disadvantaged and that they're not going to get a fair assessment of their results, of their performance, things like that, okay? So an example of it, a tool not meeting the principles assessment would be that the instructions for the candidates, instructions for the assessor are not clear enough, and that's going to lead to the assessment itself not being reliable. Okay. Question 33. What would be an example of an assessment not meeting the principles of assessment during validation? Okay. So in here, very similar to this question, this would be, let's say, again, we've got principles assessment would be validity, reliability, flexible, fairness. All right, so we're still dealing with the same ones as here. We could say that an example of it would be, okay, let's pick a different one, validity or valid. Let's say that in the validation we go through and we find that not all items from the unit are actually being assessed. And we identify that in the mapping review that we do, okay? So that would be an example of it not meeting the principles of assessment in validation, okay? But you could pick numerous examples from a validation context, okay? Question 34, how would you validate that students' answers had met the rules of evidence, okay? So we need to think about what are the rules of evidence. We've got valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Now, normally, as an assessor, you would be marking their answers. And normally, what do you use to mark a student's answers? A marker's guide or an assessor's guide, okay? So, ideally, if you're marking a student's answers, as you go through a marker, you are correlating against the marker's guide. And by checking the marker's guide, hopefully you are finding the benchmark answers And by marking against the benchmark answers, then hopefully you are going to find that the answer will be valid, okay? And let's pick another one. How would you validate student answers had met the rules of evidence? Okay, let's pick another one, authentic. Okay, let me ask you the question. How would you validate that students' answers were authentic? Well, probably you would go to the student declaration and make sure that they have actually signed the student declaration, okay? So hopefully that's made sense to you, okay? So that, folks, is the end of the short answer questions. And what we've got here is just a place for you to sign. So you're just going to put your signature there and pop the date, okay? So that, folks, is the short answer questions. And on a future webinar, I'm going to go through how to create your assessment tools, and also the validation and RPL activities are included as part of this upgrade workbook, okay? So good luck with your assessment. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to the office and give them a call, send them an email, and they will help you through with any academic questions. But remember that with the textbook, it's chapters 9, 10, and 11. Also, if you go to Google and just get flexible with your keyword search, you'll probably find most of the definitions that you are looking for, okay? So thank you for watching the webinar. Hope it's been helpful, and we will hopefully see you on the next one. All right, that is the end of the webinar.